Right now, you're listening to the Azim Digital Asks podcast, the podcast where I, Azim, talk to some of the top marketers in the industry, find out everything about them, how they got to where they are today, and more importantly, sharing some really useful marketing tips that will help everybody listening to this become better marketers. Stay tuned for another great episode. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Azim Digital Asks podcast. Very excited to bring you my guest today. In fact, I think out of all the guests that I've had before, this one definitely doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give you a brief one anyway. The co-founder of SparkToro, conference speaker, author of Lost and founder, previously founded Moz. On his Twitter bio, he says he tweets around 30 times a week on marketing, tech and startups and the rest. Genuinely nice guy. Very pleased to have him on. Rand Fishkin. Rand, welcome to the show.
Azim, thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
How are you doing today?
Yeah, up and down. I think trying to make it through this pandemic and realizing how frustrating it is to be subject to the incompetence of the United States' laws. A lot of us in the U.S. are reading about, how basically the current administration did not acquire enough of the vaccine, and so we're probably going to be several months, if not 6 months or more, behind many other wealthy countries in terms of vaccine acquisition and distribution. And that is, I don't know, it's putting a damper in that hope that maybe things will be normal again in April or May. Now it's more like, well, maybe August or September.
Yeah, hopefully that isn't the case. As an aside, I was literally just reading things on Twitter before we started recording. So there's a funny story and a not funny story. So the not funny story is that I just saw a viral tweet. By viral, I mean it's just massively shared. So it could be not true. But somebody had just put out a message saying that they'd spoken to YouTube, and basically YouTube has said you're allowed to say that Trump won the election, and you're allowed to say something like there was voter fraud separately, but if you say them together, you'll get banned from YouTube. I'm like, well, that's insane. And the funny story, to lighten the mood, is that there was, I'm sure you've probably experienced it in the States as well, massive sort of conspiracy theories around Bill Gates and 5G microchips. And over here in the UK, we had, I think she was 90, the first person to get vaccinated.
Yeah.
There was a viral tweet going around saying, I wonder how Bill Gates is coping on day one of controlling this 90-year-old woman.
Yeah. It's really odd and interesting, right? That we have 20 different applications on our phone that track our locations and exactly what we do at all times. And yet most of those, obviously, I don't think any of those are owned by Microsoft. And so it's very odd that Bill Gates, who is like the former founder, what is his goal or attribution? Like the weird thing about a lot of these conspiracy theories to me is that as you dig down into why do you believe that? It gets more and more illogical. And I think the reality is that there's this desire to have a motivation ascribed to a motivationless world, right? A virus has no motivation. It's just other than to reproduce and spread, right? It doesn't have human motivations. And so there's this desire for control in a world that feels out of control. And I understand that, but also it's immensely frustrating to me that so many of my country people are so susceptible to this and so inspired to create this nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'll put a hard stop to COVID talk there, otherwise people will check out the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I think the really interesting part to me, Azim, is that there was this great study that was published in the Atlantic today, talking about how misinformation and disinformation spreads on social networks, and specifically the researchers at MIT had analyzed, I think, the full last 13-year history of Twitter's data. So they got access through GNIP, and we're looking at all the tweets of all time and analyzing essentially the fact that false information, whether it's news or content or memes or whatever it is, right? False information spreads, something like 7 times faster, reaches a few hundred times more people than real information. And weirdly enough, it's not, the network is sort of biased against it. So they discuss how Twitter essentially puts these prominent accounts forward, right? They give blue check marks, right, to verify accounts, and the algorithm is designed to favor accounts that have shared consistently good information, and yet still the retweets and engagement, likes, comments, all those kinds of things mean that on Twitter at least, and the researchers surmise this is true on Facebook and YouTube as well, false information spreads much, much faster because it activates our emotional core better, right? And that's a thing that we want to share. We want to share things that are surprising, that fit with narratives that we already want to believe or are worried about. They activate our fear centers. It's yeah, I mean, I think this is something marketers know because it's part of our job to know this stuff. But also, we've just never had platforms like this who amplify based on engagement before.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I'm sure you may have already seen it, but if not, once we've stopped recording, I will definitely share a link with you. Some of the things that you mentioned there just reminded me of a TED talk that I watched not too long ago from Carol Cadwalader, who is an investigative journalist in the UK. I'm not sure if you're aware of her or not, but
No, I'm not.
she worked for a UK publication called The Guardian and The Observer as well. Essentially, long story short, she worked with a whistleblower and she published an investigation into Cambridge Analytica where she shared that, I think, with the New York Times. And essentially, it was about Facebook's role in Brexit and the threat to democracy. And fast forward, that investigation obviously resulted in Zuckerberg being called before Congress. And I think it was like, 100 billion wiped off Facebook's share price. It's literally it's probably one of the best TED Talks I've watched. It's about 10 minutes long. And she was just absolutely brutal. She was talking about how, I won't spoil too much, but she was talking about how the day before this was going to go to press and get published, they were getting phone calls saying, "Do not publish this. You will get a lawsuit. Lawsuits coming out of your eyeballs. Do not do it." And she went ahead with it anyway. And it was just, it's definitely one. This was before things like the Social Network came out. This was like that equivalent of that coming out. I was like, yeah, it's one that I've gone back to. I think I watched it maybe a couple of weeks back. I like going back to stuff like that and thinking, well, how different is it now? And as you said, it's not a lot different. There's lots more that can be done by the platforms to get that sorted.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things that I come across is the argument from a lot of folks in the tech space, and to be honest, in the SEO and web marketing spaces as well. I think there's like I don't know what to call it, a small but vocal minority of maybe kind of libertarian leaning folks in our space who believe that the networks should be very hands-off, right? That they should not take action to limit the spread of information, whether that's misinformation or disinformation, or whether it's false or true, that they shouldn't be fact-checking, that they shouldn't be labeling, that they shouldn't be designing their algorithms in these ways. And I find that argument sort of fascinating, right? Because it suggests a lack of thoughtfulness around the fact that the algorithms have been designed already to bias in these ways. And they're essentially suggesting that now that we're learning how it works, we should not allow Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, Reddit, whatever, to change based on their learnings, right? And to evolve. And that strikes me as a very peculiar argument, right? That essentially I want YouTube videos to recommend the same things they've always recommended. I don't want them updated because YouTube has learned that it causes armed protesters to violently attack people in the streets or whatever. It's a strange system. I saw this on Hacker News today, right, where YouTube has basically made the announcement that you talked about, right, where they're going to limit what these sort of right-wing commenters are allowed to say on their videos in terms of fraud and election disputes. And there's all these commenters that are saying basically YouTube shouldn't be allowed to be the arbiter of what gets spread and not, which is an asinine argument because YouTube already is obviously the arbiter of what gets spread and not. It's just a decision based on, do they have a right to change and to update their systems based on what they'd like to promote and not? And if your answer is no, you design the algorithm once, you're not allowed to update it. See, that's pretty odd. That's a strange argument.
I think we could probably spend the whole podcast talking about stuff like this. So I'm already planning a future episode with you, just so you know.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, I'm excited about that.
But yeah, look, let's talk a little bit about you. So before you give yourself an even better introduction than I gave you, I know you're a bit of a foodie from some of the stuff that I've seen you've put on Twitter. So my icebreaker for you is essentially a question around food. And that is, if you could only eat one meal every day for the rest of your life, what would it be and why?
Oh man, that's brutal. It's just heartbreaking to think of only having one meal. If I could be slightly flexible with it, I would say pasta, just because I can live off pasta. I could eat it all day, every day. But if you only limited me to one type of dish, that would be heartbreaking. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'd in that case maybe have to change it up and do something more veggie focused. So how would you survive on one carb loaded dish? It'd be doom.
That's what I was thinking, but yeah, we'll move swiftly on there. I genuinely don't have an answer for that question. When you
I'd die. I just suicide would be the option. No, I don't know.
But yeah, awesome. Look, as I mentioned, thanks very much for agreeing to come on the show. For anybody that is either very brand new to the industry or has been in the industry for a while and lived under like a digital rock, do you want to share a little bit more about yourself, who you are?
Sure. So I, as you mentioned in the intro, brief bio is I started a company called Moz many years ago, ran that company for a long time, raised a bunch of venture capital, stepped down during a bout of depression, and stayed at the company a few more years, and then left in 2018 to start this new company, SparkToro, which just launched its product in April. I published a book that you mentioned called Lost and Founder, which a lot of folks have read, and that's been very rewarding. I am usually on the road quite a bit, speaking at a lot of conferences and events, and meeting folks in the digital marketing world. This year, obviously, very different, but I'm looking forward to eventually getting back to that travel and speaking plan as well. I think that's put a hamper in a little bit of the marketing for SparkToro too.
Yeah, I can imagine. I did see something which I think was brilliant, where I'm sidetracking slightly, please, apologies. You did, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think with SparkToro you sent an email out to customers saying something along the lines of, and I'm sure you can put it much better than I can, but updating like your cancellation terms. I think where other companies have secretly like renewed people without them knowing, you went out and said, if you need to cancel, or we understand. I think what was the actual message? I think I'm doing a very bad job of butchering it here, but what did you go out and say to them?
Oh, I think maybe you're referring to just a standard email that we send to everyone who purchases a SparkToro subscription. So 3 days before your subscription renews, let's say you bought a monthly subscription on whatever, today is December 9th. So maybe you bought a monthly subscription on November 13th or something. And so today or tonight, you would get an email that says, "Hi, Azim. We wanted to let you know that in 3 days, SparkToro will be charging your credit card. But if you are not using the product, or if you really need to save budget, it's one click to cancel. Just follow this link, go to your account page, you'll find the cancellation right there. We know that most SaaS businesses do not send emails like this because obviously it's really bad for their churn rates, but we don't give a crap about stuff like that, and we'd rather treat our customers well. And so, yeah, a lot of people, screenshot that email and put it on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or what have you. And yeah, we've gotten a lot of praise for it. I will say, though, to be totally honest, it does affect our churn rate significantly. I would say we probably have a somewhere between 2 to 4% higher churn rate. So our monthly churn rate's around, 9-ish%, and it would probably be closer to 6% if we didn't have that notice. So, hey, we're costing ourselves a lot of money, but I hope we're also reaping a lot of goodwill from folks, and doing the right thing is kind of its own reward.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just literally going to say the same thing. You're definitely doing the right thing. And as you mentioned, lots of people are sharing that message, which is how I saw it. Awesome. Let's go back to the very beginning of your career then, Rand. I wanted to ask you, so what was this moment for you where you thought, do you know what? Marketing's the career for me. I'm going to get into this. When was that for you?
I never had that moment. Never came, right? Marketing was going into SEO was essentially something I fell into because we couldn't afford to pay our SEO subcontractors. We were like a web design and development firm. A 2-person firm, but it was basically all forcing function. And then it just turned out that, hey, I got very frustrated with how secretive the SEO world was. And so I started publishing, and that attracted something of an audience. And honestly, it kind of snowballed. So there was never an intentional moment where I said, oh, I really like marketing. It was all accidental entrepreneurship and investment up until the point where I realized, hey, I am suddenly a very well-known marketer. How'd that happen?
So full disclosure, I phrased that question in that way deliberately to see if you would be one of the first guests who actually said, you know what, yes, marketing is the career for me. Many people sort of went down that route and fell into marketing. Leads me nicely to my next question for you then, Rand. So imagine you could go back to the beginning of your career. You can jump into a time machine, go back to the start of your career, but you're armed with all of the knowledge that you've got now. On day one, what piece of advice do you think that you give to yourself?
What's funny is that is basically the introduction to Lost and Founder, right? It's essentially like, this book is if you had a time machine and could go back and hand yourself, 140 pages that you could read over 3 hours, what would you do? Read this, learn this stuff. Because, I think the big lessons for me are not around some, particular aspect of SEO or marketing. They're around incentives and structures and strategy, right? Personal strategic decisions and strategic business decisions. Why should you have a physical office if you're a digital agency or software as a service business? That was dumb. It was a ton of wasted money and effort and tons of people to look after it, and a bunch of, not to be too crass about it, but a bunch of software engineers who think that they don't have to take care of a space. So then you have to hire people who will take better care of the space. All sorts of decisions around how to fundraise for a business. Why did I raise venture capital? Oh, because I thought that no one would take me seriously if I didn't. And I wanted to play with the big kids, and I wanted to think I was important, and I wanted to see my name in TechCrunch. Oh my God, those are terrible reasons to do anything. What ridiculous silliness. Why did I spend all that time going and investing in trips to Silicon Valley and building relationships with startup founders and leaders, and like, I think it's so cool that I got invited to Sheryl Sandberg's house and I got to meet all these people. And no, that's not actually useful or interesting. That's not what makes life good or my profession better. My job was serving small and medium businesses, marketers, agencies, consultants. That's who I should have been spending time with. That's who I should have been listening to. And so, yeah, with SparkToro, I'm trying to make a lot of those decisions in better ways. And the email you mentioned around churn, right? That's a good example. I don't want to gloss over a churn and retention problem by not alerting people that we're about to charge their card. I only want them to stick with our subscription if they really, really want to use it. And frankly, SparkToro is, for many folks, it's great one-time use, once a year, twice a year, once every quarter when you have a relevant project, and then you don't really need it anymore. And so that's up to us, right? I think it's up to us to build a product that is useful to you every single week, every single month, as opposed to, relying on dark patterns to keep a subscription active.
That's a very interesting way to put it, and I will absolutely pick your brains a little bit more on SparkToro very shortly. But you mentioned there, about how people talk about Sheryl Sandberg and everything else as inspirations. I wanted to just touch on the point about inspirations in terms of for yourself. So many people, especially on previous episodes, have said, I always ask them, who inspires you in the industry? And many of them will say that you're a big inspiration for them, Rand. So firstly, what would you like to say to those people who cite you as an inspiration? And then what about yourself? Who inspires you in the industry?
Wow. My gosh, that's a little, yeah, it's humbling and honoring, and also feels like a lot of pressure, right? you gotta live up to people's expectations, and you need to be a better version of yourself every week, every month, in order to be worthy of that. But I'm thrilled that I could inspire people. I think that what's wonderful about digital marketing, especially what I truly love about this profession, is it is accessible to so many people. You do not need a college degree for a ton of jobs in this field. And many, many agencies and companies wisely, very wisely, are willing to hire people who've proven that they can do the work regardless of what their background is. And so, if you don't have means and don't want to go deep into debt to get an education, and by the way, 99% of the college programs out there are not going to teach you very much about digital marketing anyway. I love that, right? I love how accessible it is. I am inspired to see that over the 20 years I've been in the field, it's gone from, especially the SEO digital marketing side of things. When I first started on Moz, which that industry was, 90% men or more, and almost all white men. It has become massively more diverse. Today, I think the last time I saw the digital marketing survey that Moz ran, which maybe was a year or two ago, right? It was something like 45% women, 28, 30% non-white. Like it's getting there. It's got a long way to go, but it's really getting there. That's inspiring to see that not even a generation in time, we've made a ton of progress in terms of who's in the industry and how accessible it is. So I love those things. I want to keep opening up those things. But yeah, in terms of people who have inspired me, I get inspired by new people all the time. So recently, I don't know if you follow her on Twitter, but one of the folks that I've been really, really impressed by in the digital marketing space recently is Nandini Jami. She was one of the co-founders at Sleeping Giants and runs a popular Twitter account at Nandoodles. And she basically runs a business now called Check My Ads, co-founder there, and helps businesses save hundreds of millions of dollars by auditing where their advertising is being placed on the web. And essentially, Google and Facebook, I'm sure you know this well, Azim, right? They intentionally obfuscate and obscure the sources of where your ads are placed. And so, you could be Patagonia and find that, your ads are all over right-wing white supremacist pseudo-terrorist organizations' websites, and you had nothing to do with that, right? It's just that Google's display network funds these places by putting your ads on them, and unless you're auditing extremely carefully, you're never going to see them because it's opt out, not opt in. And that is it's infuriating, but it's also really impressive to see what Nandini and her co-founder Claire have done around trying to solve this problem and build some impressive technology to do it too.
Awesome. Thank you very much for sharing that, and completely agree with the points that you made about diversity there. I'm not sure if you've seen or not, but I'm happy to share it with you that last year I ran a smaller scale survey throughout the industry. God, to say last year sounds insane, by the way, because this year feels like 3 years long, right?
Right? Oh my God.
But yeah, it was a tough one because I probably wasn't expecting to see some of these results come back. I knew things weren't great and I knew they were improving. And I think I've mentioned it on another podcast somewhere before that obviously as a person of colour in the industry, it's quite frustrating that there aren't many other marketers of colour who are being put forward at conferences, for example. It's usually the same handful of people. I looked at conferences anonymously, looked at their lineups, and in terms of people of colour, for example, one particular conference had just the same black male coming back year after year, and then for 2020 pre-pandemic they had no other person other than just an entirely white lineup, so he obviously must have been busy. But then when I asked the industry that, like, what's going on, it was all anonymous. So I said, what are your thoughts about this? I was quite surprised to see that obviously the people of colour felt that their cultural or ethnic background they felt like it had an impact on their career progression. But one of the things that I was quite surprised about was white women said that they felt like their career progress hasn't been in line with their expectations. And before this survey, I was falsely under the assumption that, white people in general, male, female, and those who identify as other genders were just absolutely fine and there was no problem at all. And when I was looking at the free text and comments, it was literally a lot of stuff saying, the males in the office are getting the progression opportunities and the females are not. Everything is being bypassed to the male. So that was certainly eye-opening for me. I was going to ask you this question later on, but I'm just fast forward to it now. What do you think can be done? How do you think the industry could, a lot of eyeballs have been put on diversity and improving diversity and inclusion across the industry, and there's rightly been a lot of attention on it. How do you think the industry can keep that momentum going and drive positive change in 2021 and beyond?
Yeah. So first off, I'm going to say I am not an expert in DEI stuff, diversity, equity, inclusion. So, my opinions on this do not come from a well-researched point of view. That being said, I have spent a substantive portion of effort and time supporting folks in that world and trying to do my best. I'm sure I still have lots of work to go, no doubt about it, as do almost all of us. But the things that I have seen be successful are along a few vectors. One is when it comes to hiring and promotion, one of the most important things that you can do is to stop as a recruiting team, as someone who's writing job requirements, as someone who is promoting team members internally, get rid of as many what I'd call status requirements as you possibly can. So things like what we just talked about, did you graduate from college? What were your grades like? Did you go to certain schools? Did you have access to certain resources as a kid or young person that would have given you, sort of a leg up over other people, right? I think that what we have to recognize are two things, right? Two fundamental truths. One, that history, especially the last few hundred years of it, has been intentionally racially biased, right? Essentially rewarding people who look like me and not rewarding anybody else, right? Women, people of color, people who don't fit gender norms, people who don't have, who aren't heterosexual, people who are able-bodied, all those kinds of things, right? So let's recognize that history has done that. And then let's say, okay, how can we throw out requirements that would bias us towards people who've been advantaged in the past, right? And instead recognize the second truth, which is that talent is equally distributed. It's opportunity that's not. And so our job is, if we want to fix the problem, we must be willing to put our thumb on the scale. And this I think gets to the fundamental problem that many people are unwilling to recognize, especially people in positions of privilege and power, people in positions of historical privilege and power, right? People who look like me, who have wealth and money. And they basically look at that scale and they say, in order to be just and right, the scale must be equal. We should consider all people equally. And that is like saying, hey, let's put one person in this race 50 meters ahead of everybody else, and let's see who wins the 100-meter dash. Ridiculous, right? It's ludicrous. And that is essentially what's happened over the last few hundred years. We've taken, white, able-bodied, cisgendered, hetero men and put them 50 meters ahead of everybody else. And then everyone's, sort of staggered behind that and then said, oh, look, white guys are winning this race. Well, clearly they're the best. Let's keep hiring them. Come on, man. Right? Let's get real about what's happening here and not try and BS ourselves about history. So my sense is that in order to do that, we have to be willing to put our thumb on the scale. And that is pretty uncomfortable for a lot of people. But let me tell you a story. We did this at Moz. I did this with MozCon. So, I started this conference called MozCon, which is, fairly big industry event nowadays. A few thousand people go to it every year in Seattle. And when I started that event, it was just a couple hundred people in Seattle. I think the first event, I did all the talks myself. So embarrassing. But, basically, after the first, maybe it was 3 or 4 years, I noticed that our conference lineup looked exactly like all the other conferences I went to, AKA all white dudes, right? And I was like, oh man, this is messed up. So I think maybe the third year we did it, something like that, fourth year we did it, I was like, okay, speaker selection time comes. We are going to go for 50-50 men and women. And I remember, I shared that with a lot of folks in the industry, like people I was friends with, people like yourself and like Andy, folks like that, and there was a lot of pushback. Like, I won't name names, but there were founders of digital agencies who you would call extremely progressive today, who at the time, whatever this was, 08, 09, were basically like, that is totally wrong. That is unfair. That is not right. That is not how you fix these problems. You can't be putting quotas in. This is crazy. And fast forward a couple of years, and 3 things happened. One, our lineup got much more diverse, not just male, female, but I guess by thinking in this way, right, the lineup got more diverse. We sold way more tickets because, you know what? It turns out, I'm sure this comes as no surprise to you, Azim. I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure, but it comes as no surprise that women do not want to go to an event where 90% of the speakers are men, right? That is clearly saying to half your potential audience of buyers, this is not for you, right? And so people want to see themselves represented on stage. I want to see someone like me, right? I have full confidence that if I had started my career in in SEO and not seen that people like me were represented in the industry, I would have thought, well, it's probably not for me. I'm not sure I have a future here. Maybe I'll do something else, right? You need that representation. And the third thing that happened, in addition to selling more tickets and having more diversity, is that our speaker ratings went up, right? People said they were happier with the conference. So yeah,
Awesome.
I mean, you can't get better than that, right? The quota worked, and by the way, it got expanded several times. So to include, more representation of people of color, representation of sexual orientation, and other types of diversity, and every time the event got better. I think this year's MozCon, which was digital, and I stepped off the board right after the event was organized, so I don't have all the details, but I know that it was the best attended by far, and one of the best rated, right? And so, look, you do not have to compromise on quality. There are 50, 100, 500 speakers of color who are way better than anyone you're putting on stage right now who you haven't even thought about. And once you think about it, you will broaden your opportunity and get more great speakers out there. So representation is one, hiring is the other. Those are the two that I've focused on, at least. And I think both have helped. But, you got to be willing to have these honest conversations too. And they're not comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly the way that I put it. You have to have those uncomfortable conversations. Full confession, I am absolutely going to steal that phrase that you mentioned earlier on about talent being distributed equally and opportunities not. Brilliant way.
And that is not my line. I stole that quote from someone else, so we'll have to look it up and attribute it. But yeah, I mean, I just don't know a clearer way to say it, right? There is no doubt in my mind that talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. And it's our job to either fix that or to recognize that we are the architects of future racism and sexism and every other kind of discrimination.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more with you. I wanted to pick your brains a little bit more then about SparkToro. So the first one, essentially, I know you mentioned, about your churn rates and everything else. Would you say that's the biggest challenge that you've got now with SparkToro, or what is the biggest challenge that you've got right now? And more importantly, what's your plan to overcome it?
Yeah, I mean, so maybe it's, maybe churn rate is the biggest thing. I personally don't feel that way entirely, mostly because when we were building SparkToro, we recognized that it is a very, very useful tool for people doing research even just one time. And I'm not sure I want to take that away, right? I'm not sure that I want to say, if you don't subscribe over time and, buy many months or annual subscriptions, that this isn't useful. I don't mind having a high churn business as long as lots of people are getting lots of value and they come back when they need the product, and research tools can work that way. And so I don't need to optimize for churn rate exclusively. I'm not trying to prove to some venture capitalist, that I have a great business, which is another beautiful thing. I do think that probably the biggest challenge in my mind for SparkToro right now is getting folks to recognize and understand what the product is, what it does, how it works. I think that's been our biggest challenge because many, many folks, I would say the overwhelming majority of marketers, are not used to doing audience research in this way, right? So most people who do audience research, they're used to running surveys, right? Hey, tell us how you heard about us. Tell us, what brought you to us today. Tell us what podcasts you listen to. Tell us what YouTube channels you subscribe to, right? And you send out a survey and then you analyze the results. And you're like, okay. Or maybe you, go to something like Moz or SimilarWeb or SEMrush or something like that, and you look for your search engine result competitors, right? Sites that rank for the same keywords as you, and try to figure out if, maybe those are opportunities for us. But what you really want, right? What you really want to do is you want to get all the addresses of your customers and potential customers, go to their houses, break in, steal their phone, and look at everything that they watch and listen to and read and follow, and use that data to inform how you do your marketing, right? Reach them in the places where they actually pay attention. And SparkToro does this in a legal and ethical and privacy compliant way, right? By anonymizing and aggregating public social profiles. But it's been, it's been a real challenge every day on Twitter and in my email. I'm talking to people who are like, I don't totally get it. Like, I don't understand exactly how I'm supposed to search or what I'm supposed to do with the results or what this means or how do I find this audience. And so that challenge of creating a new category, essentially, an automated passive audience research tool. It's a lot like building Moz in the early days, right? When there was no SEO software and people were like, SEO, isn't that kind of black hat manipulative crap? And those people have terrible reputations. And is that even really marketing? Like, okay, well, we got to change perception.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks very much for sharing that. Definitely interesting, and very similarly, I think the first time I used SparkToro, I was a little bit unsure, having more of a play with it. I think sometimes, certainly in my experience and people that I've worked with in the past, if something doesn't work once, they just put it down and walk away.
Yeah, totally.
But for me, I've got to keep going until I've got some sort of an answer that I want. But yeah,
I think
definitely interested to see where you take that.
that's exactly what's happened. We've had, I think, somewhere north of 30,000 people, try SparkToro, run some free searches. But the overwhelming majority have kind of walked away, I think, with this. I don't quite get it. Like, I don't really understand what's going on here, or how the data is being acquired. I don't understand what it's telling me. I'm not sure I found the right audience. And so it's fun and interesting. Like, if I could personally spend whatever 4 minutes, 5 minutes with someone, chatting to them about their business problem that they're attempting to solve, and then running a search and showing them what it returns and explaining how, they'd be like, oh man, it blows people away. It's really cool because it's this new thing. Like, wait, you can tell me all the social accounts across all these networks that my customers and potential customers follow, and then I can just go pitch them. You can tell me the podcasts they listen to and I can go sponsor those. You can tell me the YouTube channels and then I can target those in my Google ads. You can tell me the words and phrases they talk about and then I can go into my Facebook ads and target those. Oh my God, that's freaking amazing. Right. But you gotta be able to like have that conversation, and having that at scale is difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've kind of been around the subject of failure, but it leads me very nicely to the next question then. What would you say in the last 12 months has been the biggest failure for you, and why do you think that it happened?
Biggest failure in the last 12 months. That's a great one. I think, to be honest, I have not had nearly the success in the last year with my content strategy and content marketing for SparkToro that I thought I would and could. Throughout my career, content has been something I've been very good at, and I think I've almost taken it for granted that I am good at it. But in the last 12 months, I've probably written, I don't know, maybe 70, 100 blog posts, something like that, maybe a little less than that. And, plenty of content for social, Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. And to be honest, I would say I have gotten some of the lowest levels of traction this past year that I have in the last decade of my career. I attribute some of that to the pandemic and to the election, because I think people are paying attention to those things over some digital marketing stuff. And also, I think I might be losing my touch a little bit, and I need to get back to it. Got to learn more about what really resonates with people, and try and find ways to create the content that's truly useful and valuable to them.
That has brought me very nicely to my next question, which I'll preface by saying that the blog post that I'm going to talk about is out there and everybody can read it. So I'll share a link to that in the show notes. But I wanted to ask you specifically about your blog post where you ended your tenure on Moz's board and you left. As I mentioned, the blog post is out there for everybody to read, so we don't need to talk about the content of the blog post. What I was most interested in is, where did the inspiration to write that come from? What made you think, I'm going to put this out there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, what's interesting about me is I never think the other way. Like, oh, maybe I could keep this a secret and not talk about it. um, no, I think, I have always felt an obligation to be very, very transparent. I think that's something that people who follow and know me expect of me, and that they would be surprised, maybe disappointed, even dismayed to find that, major goings on, especially as they relate to Moz, because that's where I built up that reputation for transparency, that was being kept from them intentionally when I could have shared, right? And so I'm
Yeah.
under no more obligation to Moz. And so I feel an obligation now to tell the truth as much as I'm able.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I just wanted to follow up on that and say, when you put that out there, there was a lot of reaction to it, both positive and negative. And I wanted to touch on the negative for a moment, if that's okay. I'm not going to
Sure.
say that these are the things that were said, but I just wanted to ask you, when you put content out there, as you mentioned, you're always putting out content. When you put stuff out there, and certainly in relation to this blog post, there was a wave of negativity as well as positivity as well. How do you deal with those negative responses? What's your process with that?
Hmm. I mean, I'll definitely say that early in my career, and I know plenty of folks who um, react in this way, and I think it's pretty natural, right? When you first encounter that criticism and negativity, it can feel overwhelming. I used to lay awake at nights thinking about some comment someone had left on a blog or an email I'd gotten or those kinds of things. And I don't know if this is a positive thing, but I've received so much of it over the years now that it barely makes a dent. It doesn't even get 60 seconds of playtime in my head anymore. Um, when people send those negative comments, and that's it's heartbreaking that stuff still happens. Some of it can be fair criticism, right? So I think a question
Yeah.
on that I'm stepping down from Moz's board, and here are these two amazing women who are who I nominated to the board, and Moz's board has accepted them, and here are their backgrounds, and this is why I think they're going to be so great. And some folks had that's where the blog post should have ended. You never should have talked about why you stepped down or the problems that you had with the board, or sort of your tenure the last few years, or things that you couldn't share. Like that should have stayed out of this, or should never have been published, because it doesn't pay to air dirty laundry. And I obviously considered those things and decided that on balance, I feel that it is more important to be transparent about these kinds of things when they are uncomfortable, when they are usually not talked about, when they could reflect badly on me, because those types of stories are where real learning happens, right? We learn stuff when people talk about things that are not usually talked about. And when we silence these topics that feel shameful to us or that we're embarrassed about, then we lose the value of transparency. And so, I felt that it was important. I tried to be as balanced and nuanced about it as I could, and to be fully cognizant of the fact that my perspective is only one of several, and that if you were to talk to other people on Moz's board, that you would surely get a different story. But I thought it was worth putting out there. And so, hey, for folks who still think it's a bad thing or whatever, who don't like that type of content, obviously they don't have to read it. It's it's not intended to cast aspersions on folks. It's merely it is meant to be a learning opportunity for folks who are like, what does a venture-backed company's board really look like? What are the dynamics like? What happens when bad things like layoffs and slow growth and, disappointing expectations not being met? What goes on? And I wanted to highlight that for people.
Thanks very much for sharing that. I think the point that you made about transparency really resonates. And certainly when I read the post, that's how I viewed it, through that lens of transparency rather than any other negative lens. So again, yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. I do think that the listeners will take excuse me, I do think that the listeners will take a lot of value from that. A couple more questions for you then before we have to sadly come to the end of the podcast. I genuinely think that we could be talking for hours, but full disclosure, it's like nearly 10 p.m. here. I wanted to ask you then, so what's in your digital or physical intro right now? What are you working on right now that you're able to share with the listeners?
Oh, sure. I mean, the nice thing about me is I can share everything. Let's see. So two big features that we're working on with SparkToro. So one is we have found that a lot of folks in digital PR and classic PR are using SparkToro, and that they are very interested not just in sort of the hidden gems and the niche, blogs and industry publications and those kinds of things, but they're also interested in mainstream media sources. Like, does my audience read the Washington Post, or do they read the Guardian? Do they read, do they follow the BBC, or do they follow, TechCrunch, or whatever it is, like mainstream major media publications? And so we are working on a new tab that highlights and shows exactly those for any given audience. So you can see which mainstream publications, news and media publications, are popular with, chemical engineers in France, or architects in Seattle, or software engineers in New York, or whatever it is. The second piece that we're working on goes to what we talked about around churn, which is Casey is working on a feature that will produce a series of graphs and reports that come out every 2 weeks for your account, so that you can track an audience. So you might say, I'm really interested in the audience that, whatever, follows my social account, or I'm interested in the audience that shares my competitor's website, or visits my competitor's website, or I'm interested in an audience that describes themselves with these terms and phrases, or that talks about these things online. And you can say, track this audience, and then over time, we will build a graph and show you changes to that audience. Like, oh, everybody in whatever, maybe you're tracking SEOs. And so it's like, oh yeah, look at Azim is getting followed by a lot more people in SEO. Last month he was followed by 0.3% of all SEOs. This month it's 1% of all SEOs. Like, he's really growing among this group of people. That is designed to help folks be able to identify opportunities, identify what's influential, what new topics are of interest, potentially do some keyword research or content marketing, PR, even advertising with that data. So I'm excited about that. I think there will be a ton more value to be shown by having that data over time, and by being able to say, oh, I'm interested in this audience's activity every few weeks, and I want to see what's changing with them.
Awesome. Yeah, that definitely sounds like the industry is going to be appreciative of that. So I'm definitely looking forward to when that comes out. Couple more for you then, and this one I am very keen to see how your mind works. So I asked this to all of my guests. If we swapped roles right now, what question would you ask yourself that I've not asked you already?
Oh man, gosh, I think a lot of it depends on your audience, which, if we swapped roles, hopefully I would know your audience really well. And
I was going to say.
yeah, depending on that. I mean, one of the things that we have not discussed is a lot of like tactical tips around, digital marketing stuff.
Okay, so if you could share one quick fire tip that's going to help listeners to become better marketers, what would that be?
Oh man, what kind of marketers are we talking about here?
Any marketers you can think of. So the audience is largely SEOs, but I have done episodes with PPCs, social media, various forms of marketing, but largely SEO. So you can stick to SEO if you want to.
Sure, sure. Yeah, so I'm out of the SEO world a little bit, obviously, but
Yeah.
I have a theory, Azim, and that theory is I believe Google's deep learning algorithm is weighting unlinked mentions um, and um, brand mentions more than it is links by themselves.
Hmm.
I know that lots of SEOs are still link building. They believe that links are hugely important. I think links still matter. I think you can still move the needle with links. I think you can test that pretty easily by picking a random string of anchor text and pointing some links from sites and seeing like, oh yeah, that did raise the rankings, all that kind of stuff. So I'm not saying that links don't work. What I'm saying is, in the case of many, many queries, especially those that are popular, mainstream, whether we're talking e-commerce or B2B or informational queries, that Google is learning that people prefer content from certain brands, and those brands have attributes that correlate better with being mentioned in what I'd call sort of media and sources of influence and industry publications, more so than raw links alone. And so,
Yeah.
and I think that the deep learning methodology will not necessarily expose that even to Google's engineers. You'll just sort of feel it over time in the algorithm. And that is what I have been feeling over time in the algorithm, that you can gain links fast to your competitors. You can sort of outlink build them and still lose to them in the search results because they are getting more brand coverage than you are.
Hmm. That is one that will resonate and pique the interest of the audience, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Last one from me, then, before we have to part ways, sadly. The short version of this question is essentially, how do you get into your most productive zone? The longer version of that question is, if you listen to music to get into that zone, what is your go-to song, artist, playlist? How do you do
No, I'm kind of a silent worker. I need it
that?
totally devoid of sound to work well. But the way for me to get into the zone is it's a combination of three things: being well rested, so a couple 3 days where I've gotten good sleep every night, 8+ hours. That is huge. That really helps me be in the zone. Second thing is a clean inbox. So if I can get to inbox zero, this is why I tend to do a lot of my content creation work nights and weekends, because I can get to inbox zero and then go to work. The third thing that helps me really get in the zone is getting excited, especially emotionally excited about something, right? Like, oh, I have someone to prove wrong, or something that I really need to get off my chest. That week where I spent the whole week basically writing about marketing takeaways from the election, from the US election.
Yeah.
That is probably the hardest I have worked all year. I think I, probably put in north of 60 hours, maybe even 70 hours that week. And the results were incredibly disappointing. I actually wrote a blog post about how
Yeah.
disappointing
Yeah.
the results were. But regardless, right, that was me in the zone. Like, I think I was producing, whether it was well received or not, producing some of my best written work in years, and best marketing thinking in years, and doing so at a relatively rapid pace. I don't know that I've done a combination of sort of visuals and text creation of that quantity maybe since I wrote my book.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. Sadly, that is the end of the podcast. Just from me, a massive thank you for taking the time out to be a guest on the show. I do appreciate it. I know you've got a busy schedule.
It is absolutely my pleasure. I really appreciate you having me on, and yeah, hopefully we can chat again sometime.
I just wanted to say the last part, if people wanted to get in touch with you, find out more about you, how can they do that? What's the best way to get in contact with you?
Oh, sure. I'm Rand at SparkToro.com. And obviously, if you want to give SparkToro a spin, Give us any feedback about it. You can create a free account, run 10 free searches a month for forever at SparkToro.com.
Awesome. Yeah, look, thanks very much for doing this. Really appreciate it. I think I might have mentioned it at the start of the show, maybe when we talked before. You were one of the guests I was quite keen to get on the show. Spoke to some of my friends before and said, look, I've got a draft email sitting in my inbox. It's been there since July. But I appreciate you taking the time. And as always, I give my guests the last word on the podcast. So open forum, within reason. The last word on this show is all yours, Rand.
Oh my gosh. Well, for all of you who are listening to Azim, I hope that you help share his amazing work here, because I hope you can tell he is a really talented interviewer. And yeah, man, I look forward to hearing some more from you, to seeing you on some stages. I want to see that Azim keynote in the next couple of years.
So that was another great episode in the bag. I'm really enjoying hearing from some brilliant people in this industry. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow me on Spotify. Please leave a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you are using. Tell a friend to tell a friend, and hopefully see you for the next episode.